Near midnight, the library corridor echoed as if heavy velvet still muffled every sound, even though the building stood empty for years. Under the surveillance camera's dead eye, a man who called himself only the archivist paused at the professor's study. The lock yielded with a practiced twist, emitting the faintest metallic whimper, and he slipped inside. By now, the scent of old glue and crumbling pages in the stacks was as familiar as his own skin. As he knelt before a battered filing cabinet, his hands worked silently, extracting a folder bound in red twine. Not a university issue color, but something else. A marker of personal codes few would ever decipher. On the roster, it was accrual receipts, 1993 to 2001. But what it really contained, no catalog would acknowledge. Transcripts, handwritten notes, fragments of official protocols, names paired with currencies, dates, even a faded, almost apologetic Polaroid of a handshake in a church rectory. He lifted it and understood once again why men could vanish without trace, how a single archive could cast such an immense shadow. Professor Pietro Gambisi's arrival at the university was remembered with a kind of conspiratorial fondness even decades later. They said he wore second-hand coats and carried anecdotes about impossible governments, about committees that fleeced and pardoned in equal measure, about ministers whose loyalty depended on the thickness of the carpet in their offices. His seminars on societies in flux bled over into the evenings, candles flickering on the seminar table, as if conjuring spirits from between the lines of history textbooks. But he was a man for whom the written word was never just a record. It was a weapon, a key, a liability. Long before his appointment, Gambisi had cultivated relationships with priests who needed favors, with tax officials whose handwriting he could mimic, and with a thin smile reserved for certain businessmen whose donations to endowed chairs arrived from offshore trusts. He respected the mechanics of influence, not because of ambition, but because of the anticipation, the thrill of maneuvering through webs few ever saw. "You don't need to own the spider," he once told a young assistant. "Just know where it waits for the fly." Legitimate power and illicit advantage, the professor observed their collisions and couplings with anthropologists' delight. As the grand old city began its discreet transformation, derelict blocks blossoming overnight into luxury condominiums, obscure charities swelling with donations, an inexplicable proliferation of academic conferences sponsored by construction conglomerates, those who watched closely noticed Gambisi's name on ever more advisory boards. Some wondered how he could attend so many episcopal lunches, hospital gala dinners, and discreet banking breakfasts. His former students, now scattered through the corridors of civic power, murmured about emergency consultations. A call at midnight, a locked study, a cryptic notebook entry in the professor's tiny, precise hand. It began with a single grant, officially for research into urban renewal, awarded to a foundation that listed a parish priest, a regional assemblywoman, and the professor as its trustees. The paperwork was flawless. The funds vanished and reappeared, funding not just urgent repairs to church roofs, but the acquisition of a glassworks frequented by particular friends of the bishop. The university, eager for civic legitimacy, watched as Gambisi navigated a world of informal exchanges where the blessing of a parish and the stamp of a regulator held equal sway. Slowly, the city's aging hospital was rebuilt in stages, each segment baptized with donor names that, if traced, led through shell companies managed by a retired notary in Zurich. Medical equipment arrived with suspicious swiftness. So did certain patients, always from remote regions, always discharged with unlikely speed and gratitude. In the silence of these transactions, the professor was careful to observe. There were always 3 copies of every agreement, always one for the ministry, one for the foundation, and one slipped into his private archive, meticulously hidden behind a false back in the library. But archives, like rivers, always moved toward the sea, and Gambisi's was egregiously disciplined. He saved not just contracts, but handwritten receipts, thank you notes passed between priests and magistrates, and the odd, chilling envelope, photocopies of bills paid by funeral homes to charitable trusts, marked for the children, that no orphanage ever acknowledged. On the night of a local election, when whispers about a briefcase in the vestry circled among city officials, the professor spent hours hunched at his desk, cross-referencing the signatures of donors against a ledger perpetually just inside the bounds of legality. When questioned in public, he would only smile. The memory of a city is built on what it forgets. Few dared confront him openly. The chief of staff, a former PhD student, came by once ostensibly to discuss a curriculum reform. He waited until Gambisi poured brandy and shut the blinds, then repeated a warning he'd heard at a banking luncheon. There are archives that kill. God forgive the soul who keeps them. They sipped in silence. Across the street, a cathedral's bells tolled the hour, as if marking the passing of some silent entente between faith and fraud. Beneath the facade of procedural rigor, the professor's true innovation was existential. He saw systems as permeable, defined as much by what they omitted as by what they recorded. He taught junior colleagues to never use an office phone for delicate calls, to avoid email for anything that looked like history. Paper, he would intone, could be destroyed, but electronic archives had afterlives, summoning auditors and commissions like ghosts at a seance. To those who occupied borderlands, the hospital administrator whose brother-in-law owned 3 cleaning companies, the university controller who married into a real estate dynasty, he offered cryptic assurances. If a tree falls in the archive, did it ever grow? The implication was always the same. What you don't keep can't be subpoenaed. His relationships with the city's underworld were never direct. He disliked the violence but admired their discipline. The criminal network itself was organized according to rituals as old as the church, more intricate than the police suspected. Laundry businesses, flower shops, and funeral parlors served as nodes. Large sums flowed, always in round numbers, always routed through institutions whose oversight boards featured at least one name from Gambisi's endless Rolodex. When the syndicate required medical exceptions, a convenient death certificate, a missing test result, the hospital's chief of pathology scribbled directives in a pocket ledger, which he burned each quarter with operatic solemnity. Yet a duplicate encoded in the professor's own cipher survived, buried among caustic asides in Latin, a gloss added to a marginalia of Aquinas. Occasionally, a rival network would attempt to muscle in, to penetrate the professor's web. They underestimated the subtlety required. Hospital supply contracts were tendered, but always with specifications so baroque, requiring a vintage of antibiotics last manufactured 10 years ago, that only a single favored vendor could fulfill them. Investigative journalists nosed about, but their leads expired in a labyrinth of professional ethics reviews and sealed academic grants, policed by a faculty committee Gambisi himself advised. When a principled whistleblower filed a report, she soon found herself transferred to a rural post, her inbox flooded with legal requests for records never created, her every statement contested by witness affidavits signed at midnight in sacristies or hospital backrooms. The proximity between virtue and vice bred its own peculiar code. At hospital board meetings, the chaplain would offer a prayer for those in the shadows, as administrators exchanged knowing glances. Financial audits always matched, cash in, cash out, no one the wiser. Behind the scenes, the professor cultivated his own method for laundering not only money but reputations, the awarding of honorary doctorates to benefactors whose largesse concealed impure origins, the ritual hosting of policy lectures, whose panelists had all once signed incomplete tax forms, the quiet bestowing of faculty titles on certain children of influential men. These honors had a value transcending cash, offering clean CVs and fortified backstories to those who might one day require plausible deniability. But if the system numbed itself through reciprocal favors, the underlying anxiety never abated. Even the mafia people, those rumored to be fearless, respected the thin, unwritten line between what was known and what was provable. Before a wiretapped meeting, a bishop was overheard muttering, "Saints and sinners share the same cloak, but saints never keep receipts." The phrase moved in whispers from sacristy to boardroom, its origins always attributed to someone else. For all its insidiousness, the truth was so mundane, it hurt. Occasionally, in the murk of the city's official archives, a file would simply disappear, misplaced, archived in error, perhaps burned by mistake during a records retention audit. The public version of history was always incomplete, curated more by omission than invention. There was a period late in Gambisi's career when pressure mounted. A new government arrived, promising transparency in civic affairs. Journalists, some of them former students, hunted for clues in procurement contracts, trying to decipher which system of bribes might be operative. An anti-corruption magistrate, whose mother had once confessed to the professor, became a fixture at university lectures, lurking at the back of seminar halls waiting for a slip. A stray fact. Someone leaked an anonymous tip-off. All trails lead to the professor's archive. For a week, the campus bristled with unease. At midnight, a small group of trusted confidants gathered in Gambisi's office. They spoke in veiled language, referencing the ledger only obliquely, as if the act of naming was in itself incriminating. That night, Gambisi made his decision. From the safe hidden behind his bookcase, he extracted the infamous archive. Dossiers bound by cryptic color codes, each representing a different sector. Parish funds, hospital grants, academic kickbacks, compromised construction permits. With steady hands, he began to excise the most dangerous documents, those whose absence would never be noticed. Records of transactions completed, alliances broken, enemies departed. The process was surgical, a removal not just of evidence but of memory itself. One by one, he carried these pieces to the university incinerator, timing his actions for the hour before the cleaning crew's arrival. The room filled with the scent of burning leather and aging glue. The aftermath was anticlimactic. The investigation fizzled, stymied by missing invoices, contradictory witness statements, overwritten backup tapes. The magistrate transferred to a southern province. The hospital director received a papal commendation for community service. The foundation's accounts closed quietly, its funds redistributed for the common good. A handful of rumor-mongers insisted that one day, when the city's history was finally unearthed, everything would point back to a single shelf in a forgotten campus library. But no one could prove what no longer existed. Yet the legacy endured, quietly, in the habits of those who inherited the mechanisms. A junior priest folded bribe envelopes with the same neat creases Gambisi had demonstrated. A young administrator, confronted by an inexplicable audit, replied, "The archive? What archive?" The ritual of selective memory persisted, a comforting fiction that the city's pillars remained unsullied, even as donations continued untraced, as appointments were made via unlogged phone calls, as a new file with red twine appeared, years later, in the back of an office marked Historical Research Restricted. Behind closed doors, insiders repeated the old refrain, "It's not what you know, it's what you can prove." But deeper down, they knew the real hazard had always been in what could not be proven, the fragments that could not be reconstructed, the stories told in vanished ledgers and incinerated Polaroids. As for the professor, he retired to a country house by the sea, revered in public, spoken of in private, as a man who had mastered the true art of survival. The selective erasure of guilt, not from conscience, but from the record itself. The city, for all its new facades, would always bear the imprint of his vanished archive, living proof of how the cleanest institutions are shaped as much by what they forget as by what they remember. Even now, as midnight approaches and silent corridors gather dust, someone, somewhere, remembers what was erased and is careful, always, to write nothing down.